It was a normal day at school, or so it seemed. Students were scattered across the classroom, a hum of quiet chatter filling the air as they prepared for the lesson. But for one girl, this routine moment was about to turn into something she'd never forget, something that would leave everyone in the room frozen in shock. As she sat at her desk, a mix of excitement and nerves danced in her chest. She had been looking forward to this day for weeks, a day where she could finally show everyone what she was capable of, a day where she would prove herself. But none of that mattered when the teacher, in front of the entire class, suddenly called her out. The words that followed weren't just embarrassing, they were downright humiliating. She had never expected that this was how things would go. The teacher's voice rang out, sharp and accusing. "I'm disappointed," they said, eyes scanning the room as if they were speaking to a student who had failed them. But it wasn't just the words that stung, it was the way they spoke to her, like she didn't belong, like she was less than the rest. The classroom went silent. Even the other students, who had no idea what was going on, could feel the tension in the air. There was no room to defend herself, no space to speak up. She could feel every eye on her, every whisper growing louder. She sat there, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over. The shame was almost unbearable. But what no one in that room knew was that she wasn't just any student. She wasn't the shy girl at the back of the class. No, she was someone who had a story no one knew, a story that was about to change everything. As the lesson continued, whispers began to spread. The girl tried to hold her composure, but it was clear that something wasn't right. She had always been strong, always kept her head up, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something no one had seen coming. Everyone in the class knew something was off, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. They had no idea who she really was or what she was capable of. And then, just as the bell was about to ring and everyone thought the moment was over, the truth started to leak out. First, it was just a whisper, then another, and then the entire class was talking about it. The girl they had just watched be torn apart by her teacher? She was someone far more important than they could ever imagine. She wasn't just another student. She was someone who had a reputation, someone who had power, someone who had been quietly watching the world unfold around her. No one knew what to think. Everyone who had once looked down on her, who had whispered behind her back, now stood in stunned silence. The teacher, who had humiliated her just moments ago, now realized they had made a huge mistake. But it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. And just when it seemed like everything was about to settle down, there was a final twist, a piece of information that would change the entire school's view of her, forever. What was this big reveal? Who was she really? And how would her classmates respond to the truth? The shock was only beginning, and the real story was just about to unfold. The whispers in the classroom grew louder, but they weren't just about the teacher's harsh words anymore. The students exchanged puzzled looks, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. The girl, still sitting at her desk with her head slightly bowed, tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. She could feel the weight of their stares, the weight of their judgment. It wasn't just the embarrassment of what had happened, it was the realization that everyone's perception of her was about to change. For a moment, she wondered if it was all worth it. Was standing up for herself, was showing them who she really was, really going to make a difference? Or was she just setting herself up for even more disappointment? The questions ran through her mind, faster than she could answer them. She couldn't deny that the thought of confronting the entire school, showing them just who she was, terrified her. But there was something inside her that refused to stay quiet. She had spent so long hiding in the shadows, letting people walk all over her, pretending to be something she wasn't, just to fit in. Today, she couldn't do that anymore. When the bell rang and the classroom erupted in noise, she quickly gathered her things, trying to make her exit as inconspicuous as possible. But even then, she could feel eyes following her every move. She rushed out into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the kind of attention she wanted, but it was attention nonetheless. Her mind raced as she walked through the school's halls, the chatter behind her growing louder and louder. She had to get away, at least for a little while. She made her way to the girls' bathroom, the only place she could find some peace and privacy. Inside, she leaned against the cold sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The girl who stared back at her was someone she hardly recognized, someone who had been broken by one single moment. The humiliation was written all over her face. But that wasn't who she really was. She knew that. She had to remind herself of that. She wasn't just a girl sitting in a classroom, crushed by the weight of a teacher's words. She had a story. She had a past, a truth that nobody knew about. And now, it seemed like it was finally time for the world to know. The problem was, she wasn't sure how much longer she could hide it. This secret, this piece of her life that she had carefully tucked away, was too big to stay hidden forever. It wasn't just about her anymore. The story she was carrying, the identity she had buried deep down, was something that involved everyone. The classroom, the school, maybe even the world would never be the same after they learned the truth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a message from someone she never expected to hear from today. It was from a close friend, someone who knew just how badly she had been affected by the teacher's words. She had always confided in them about the struggles she faced, but now, everything was different. The message was short, but it said enough to make her stomach drop. It's all over the school. They're talking about you. Everyone knows. She felt her breath catch in her throat. It was too soon. She wasn't ready for this. She hadn't even begun to understand how to deal with what had happened. The truth was out, and she hadn't even had the chance to control the narrative. But even as panic surged through her, there was another feeling, a strange sense of power. The moment she had feared was here, but it wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a chance for her to take control, to own her story. Maybe she wasn't as powerless as she thought. Still, the thought of walking into that cafeteria, facing the stares of students who had only ever seen her as just another girl, made her knees feel weak. She wasn't ready to walk into the storm. She wasn't ready to face them all. But she couldn't hide forever. The door to the bathroom opened with a creak, and a few girls walked in. They glanced at her briefly before starting to chat, oblivious to the fact that she was the center of the rumors spreading through the school. It was only when one of them mentioned her name that her heart skipped a beat. "I can't believe what happened in class," one of the girls said. "Who knew she had it in her?" Another girl chimed in, "No, I heard she's related to someone important. That's why the teacher was so rude. He doesn't know who he messed with." The mention of her being related to someone important made her freeze. She had heard rumors about her family for years, but this was different. Someone knew something. Or maybe they thought they did. She didn't know which was worse. The thought of her family being dragged into this mess made her stomach churn. She had kept them out of it for so long, but now it seemed like there was no avoiding it. The girls' voices faded as they left the bathroom, still gossiping about her. She stood there for a few moments longer, letting their words echo in her mind. But she knew she couldn't stay hidden here forever. Eventually, she had to face it all. With a deep breath, she straightened up, wiped her face, and walked out of the bathroom. The hallways were crowded, filled with students heading to their next class. She tried to blend in, to become just another face in the crowd. But the whispers followed her, and the weight of their stares felt heavier with every step she took. She found herself standing at the entrance to the cafeteria, the sounds of laughter and conversation spilling out into the hallway. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should just turn around and go back to class. But something inside her urged her forward. She couldn't hide from this. She couldn't hide from who she was. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and walked in. The noise seemed to quiet down as soon as she stepped inside. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Whispers filled the air, but this time, they weren't about the teacher's harsh words. This time, they were about her. The girl who had been humiliated in front of the entire class. The girl who was supposed to be just another student, except she wasn't. Not anymore. She made her way to the lunch line, trying to keep her head high. Her heart was racing, and every step felt like it was leading her closer to a tipping point. She could feel the tension in the room, could almost hear the anticipation in the air. But when she reached the counter, something unexpected happened. One of the boys, a student she didn't even know, stepped forward and stopped her. "Hey," he said. His voice low but loud enough for her to hear. "You don't have to take this. You don't have to let them treat you like this." She blinked, taken aback. For a moment, it seemed like he was the only one who didn't see her as just a girl in trouble. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't gossiping behind her back. He was standing up for her. But before she could respond, the sound of someone clearing their throat interrupted them both. The teacher, the same one who had humiliated her in class earlier, was standing at the other end of the cafeteria, watching them with narrowed eyes. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The game had just begun. The teacher's presence in the cafeteria was like a shadow hanging over her. His eyes, still sharp and disapproving from earlier, scanned the room as if he owned it. She could feel his gaze boring into her, and the warmth of the boy who had stepped in to support her felt like a distant memory. He had already backed away, his lunch tray in his hands, and the whispers surrounding her had picked up again. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. She tried to ignore it all, to push past the discomfort, but the eyes on her were impossible to escape. It wasn't just the teacher now. Students from all corners of the cafeteria had noticed her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. The girl who had always kept to herself, the one who rarely caused a stir, was now at the center of it all. She could feel the weight of her own heartbeat in her ears. As she made her way to an empty table, she couldn't help but glance over at the teacher one more time. He was still standing there, watching her, his expression unreadable. It was clear he wasn't going to let this go. And why should he? She had embarrassed him, made him look foolish in front of the class. It didn't matter if she had a reason or not. In his eyes, she was just another student who had crossed him. He was a man with power in this place, and power like that was not easily forgotten. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the teacher wasn't the only one who had noticed her. Other students, who had always seen her as just an invisible face in the crowd, were now watching her with a different kind of interest. Some were talking about her quietly, whispering about the rumors that had been flying since the moment the bell rang. Others were wondering what exactly had happened in class that had caused the teacher to lash out at her. They couldn't understand it. She had always been so quiet, so compliant. What had changed? As she sat down at the table, trying to block out the noise around her, she caught a glimpse of someone she hadn't expected to see today. A girl she hadn't spoken to in months, a once close friend who had drifted away after a falling out. The girl was standing at the edge of the cafeteria, watching her, a knowing look on her face. The girl's eyes flicked nervously between her and the teacher. Her lips moved, though no sound reached her ears. It was as if the girl was debating whether or not to come over. Eventually, she hesitated, gave a small shake of her head, and turned to leave. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a chill down her spine. It was as if her old friend, someone she had trusted, was now distancing herself from her. And it hurt more than she was willing to admit. But the worst part wasn't the whispers. It wasn't even the teacher's lingering stare. It was the realization that she was caught in something bigger than herself. The truth she had tried so hard to keep buried, the one she had kept secret from everyone, was slipping into the open. She could feel it like a dam slowly cracking, the pressure building on the inside. Soon, there would be no stopping it. The next class after lunch felt like an eternity. Every second dragged on as she sat there, trying to focus on the lesson, but her mind kept wandering. How had it gotten to this point? How had the small incident in the classroom turned into something so huge, so impossible to control? Every movement, every word, felt magnified. It was as if the entire school was watching her every step. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take the weight of it all anymore, the bell rang again, signaling the end of the day. She hurried to gather her things, desperate to escape the eyes that followed her. But as she moved toward the door, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was the boy from earlier, the one who had stood up for her in the cafeteria. His face was serious, but there was something else in his eyes, something that told her he knew more than he had let on. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I know what you're going through. It's not easy. But you don't have to face this alone." She froze, surprised by his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "I've seen the way people look at you. I know they're spreading rumors. But trust me, I know what it's like to feel like everyone's against you. I've been there." He paused for a moment, his expression softening. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. You don't have to hide." She stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Was this real? Was he just another person trying to get close to her out of curiosity? Or was he genuinely trying to help? It was hard to tell. But for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was reaching out to her. She didn't have the answers, but maybe, just maybe, this was the first sign of something good. Maybe she wasn't completely alone. But before she could say anything, the teacher appeared in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room once again. The boy stepped back, as if he had already said too much, and quickly disappeared into the hallway. The teacher's eyes met hers for a split second, and it was enough to make her stomach tighten. There was a coldness in his gaze, a quiet warning that she couldn't ignore. He wasn't finished with her, and neither was the rest of the school. As she walked through the halls to her locker, she passed by groups of students who were whispering and pointing, some of them glancing over at her with fear, others with disdain. They all had questions, questions she didn't have the answers to. What had happened in class? Why had the teacher reacted the way he did? And most of all, who was she really? The truth hung over her like a storm cloud, threatening to break free. It was just a matter of time before everyone knew. But could she really face it? Could she face the storm that was coming? And then, just as she was about to close her locker and head home, her phone buzzed again. Another message, but this one was different. It wasn't from her friend, and it wasn't from anyone she recognized. It was a number she didn't know, and the message was simple, yet chilling. "I know who you are. And so will everyone else soon enough." Her heart raced as she stared at the words. Who had sent this? What did they know? And how much of her story had already been revealed? She closed her phone and took a deep breath. The tension, the mystery, everything, it was all coming to a head. There was no turning back now. The message on her phone sent a chill through her entire body. "I know who you are. And so will everyone else soon enough." The words echoed in her mind like a countdown ticking away in the background. Who could it be? And what exactly did they know? Her hands trembled slightly as she slipped the phone back into her pocket, but the questions swirling in her mind were impossible to silence. She had spent years carefully constructing the walls around her life, keeping her secrets close, burying the things she didn't want anyone to know. Yet now, it felt like those walls were crumbling, piece by piece. Whoever had sent the message clearly had more information than they should. She couldn't stay in the hallways much longer. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the air around her was growing thicker with every passing second. The whispers followed her wherever she went, and she couldn't tell if they were about her or just another set of rumors circulating through the school. But the tension in the air was undeniable. Every student she passed seemed to be watching her, some pretending not to notice, others staring just a little too long. The teacher's cold, calculated stare earlier was still fresh in her mind, and as she passed by his classroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching her, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. His presence had always been oppressive, but now it felt like something darker was brewing. She had no idea what he was planning, but she couldn't shake the sense that it was far from over. The hallways were quieter now, with the last bells signaling the end of the day. Students were filing out of the building, heading home or off to extracurricular activities. But for her, the day wasn't over. The weight of the secret that she could no longer keep hidden pressed heavily on her shoulders, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. She made her way toward the exit, hoping to make it out of the building without running into anyone else. The last thing she wanted was more attention, more stares, more questions. But as she reached the front doors, a figure stepped into her path, blocking her way. It was the boy from earlier, the one who had tried to offer her support in the cafeteria. His expression was serious, and there was a hint of urgency in his eyes. "I'd been hearing things," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "About you. About what happened in class. And I think I might know what's going on." Her heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? How much did he know? She wasn't ready to talk about it, not now, not here. She couldn't even begin to explain everything that was happening. But before she could say anything, he stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "I know this is hard, but you don't have to hide anymore," he said. "People are talking, and it's only going to get worse if you keep quiet. Whatever it is, whatever secret you're carrying, it doesn't have to define you. You can take control. You just have to trust me." She stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Trust him? How could she trust anyone when everything felt so out of control? But there was something in his eyes, something that told her he wasn't just trying to pry into her life. He genuinely seemed to care. And maybe that was what scared her the most. Before she could reply, a loud voice broke through the tension. It was the teacher again, this time much closer, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. She looked over at him and felt her heart race as he approached, his expression as stern as ever. The boy turned, facing the teacher head on. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The teacher's gaze shifted from the boy to her, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. The teacher's lips twisted into something resembling a smirk, but it wasn't a smile. It was something colder, something far more dangerous. "There's no problem," the teacher said, his voice smooth, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Not yet." The words hung in the air, and she felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She had no idea what he meant, but the look on his face told her that whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be good. The boy seemed to sense the tension as well, his body going rigid. "I think you should leave her alone," he said, his voice firm. The teacher's eyes flickered with irritation, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down the hallway, as if considering something, then turned back to her, his gaze sharp and calculating. "We'll see how long you can keep hiding, won't we?" he said before turning on his heel and walking away. Her pulse raced, her mind reeling. What had just happened? What was he planning? And why did it feel like he was only getting started? The boy watched the teacher retreat down the hallway before turning back to her. "He's dangerous," he said quietly. "But you don't have to face this alone. You have options." Her mind was spinning. The teacher, the rumors, the messages, all of it was coming to a head. She didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending that everything was fine, that she was in control of her own life. And now, with the boy offering his support, it felt like there was no turning back. But just as she was about to speak, her phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her pocket, the screen lighting up with a new message. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked it, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. "It's time. You're going to have to face everyone soon. The truth will come out, whether you're ready or not." Her heart pounded in her chest. The message wasn't signed, but she recognized the same tone from before. Whoever this was, they knew everything. The time was coming, and there was no stopping it. The boy beside her watched her face closely, sensing her panic. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. There were no more words to say. Everything was out of her control now, and she had no idea what the consequences would be. The storm was coming, and it was going to hit harder than anything she had ever imagined. All she could do was brace herself. The seconds stretched like hours as she stared at the message on her phone. Her hands shook, and the world around her seemed to blur. The words, simple yet chilling, felt like a death sentence. "It's time. You're going to have to face everyone soon. The truth will come out, whether you're ready or not." Her throat tightened, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when everything would finally be exposed, but now that it was here, she realized she wasn't prepared at all. Her mind raced. What truth? What did this person know? Was it someone from her past? Or was it the teacher, the one who seemed intent on making her life miserable? Her breath quickened as the weight of the situation settled on her shoulders, suffocating her. And then, just when she thought she couldn't feel more overwhelmed, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. The number was unfamiliar. Hesitating for a moment, she swiped to answer. "Hello?" Her voice came out breathless, betraying the panic that had already taken hold. There was silence on the other end for a beat, before a deep, familiar voice spoke, one she never thought she'd hear again. "You've been keeping secrets," the voice said, its tone cold and calculated. "And now, it's time for the truth to come out." Her stomach dropped as recognition slammed into her like a freight train. It was him. The person from her past, the one she had worked so hard to forget, had found her again. How? Why now? What do you want? She managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh, I don't want much," the voice on the phone said with a hint of amusement. "I just want to make sure the people who've been protecting you know who you really are." Her blood ran cold. The boy from earlier, the one who had stepped up to help her in the cafeteria, was all she could think of. Was he at risk too? Was everyone she had come to care about now part of this mess? "Don't," she whispered into the phone. "Please don't hurt anyone." There was a soft chuckle from the other end. "Hurt them? No. I'm not interested in hurting anyone. But the truth? The truth is a much more powerful weapon than you realize. And it's coming for you." The call ended abruptly, leaving her holding the phone, her mind reeling. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, each question feeding into the next. How had he found her? What did he know? What would happen if this person exposed everything? She looked over at the boy who had stood by her earlier. His eyes were full of concern, but there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite place. He could tell she was shaken, but he had no idea just how much. He didn't know that the past she had spent years hiding from was about to resurface. He didn't know the lengths she had gone to in order to protect herself and the people she cared about. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. She wanted to say yes, to tell him everything would be fine, but the truth was, nothing was fine. Everything was falling apart, and she couldn't control it anymore. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice barely audible. This thing, whatever it is, it's not just about me anymore. It's bigger. It's dangerous." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to rest on her shoulder, offering comfort that she wasn't sure she deserved. "You don't have to face it alone. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out." But as much as she wanted to believe him, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to all of this than even he realized. Whoever was behind this, whoever had sent those messages, whoever had called her had a plan. And they weren't going to stop until it had all unraveled. As if on cue, the school bell rang again, signaling the end of the day. Students began to file out of the building, and she could feel the weight of their gazes, like 1,000 pairs of eyes staring her down. The whispers she had tried so hard to ignore were growing louder, sharper. There was no escaping it now. She and the boy walked out together, the weight of the secret they both carried hanging heavy between them. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the threat of something that was about to happen. But just as they reached the doors, something unexpected happened. A figure appeared in front of them, blocking their path. It was the teacher. He stood there, a dark figure framed by the fading light of the afternoon, his eyes hard as steel. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "I knew you couldn't stay quiet forever." Her heart pounded in her chest as the boy beside her stiffened. This wasn't just about a classroom dispute anymore. This was personal. The teacher stepped closer, and she instinctively took a step back. "You've been a problem for too long," he continued, his words low and venomous. "But don't worry. You won't be a problem for much longer." Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of it. What did he mean by that? Why was he suddenly so involved? The boy beside her stood his ground. "What do you want from her?" he asked, his voice firm. The teacher smirked, his eyes narrowing. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's coming. And I'm just here to make sure she doesn't get in the way." A silence settled between them, thick and uncomfortable, like the calm before a storm. She could feel the fear building inside her again, the kind of fear that made her stomach twist. She had no idea what the teacher was talking about, but the coldness in his eyes told her that whatever was coming next, it would be devastating. And then, as if to add to the growing chaos, her phone buzzed once more. The screen lit up with a new message: "It's time for you to make your move. Everything is about to change. Be ready." Her heart skipped a beat. The message was clear, it was happening now. Her world tilted, and she realized that the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. No matter what she did, there was no escaping the truth now. The past was coming to collect, and no one, not her, not the boy who had tried to help, and certainly not the teacher, was ready for what was about to unfold. The final pieces were falling into place. The game was about to begin. And she had no choice but to play. The air around her felt thick, like a storm was about to break. The teacher's eyes glinted with malice as he stepped closer, every word out of his mouth heavy with intent. The boy at her side didn't flinch, though she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists. "Get out of the way," the boy said firmly, his voice unwavering. But the teacher didn't move. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, a sound that sent chills running down her spine. "You really think you can stop this?" The teacher sneered, his gaze now turning to her, as if he had already won. "It's already too late. You've been hiding for too long." She took a shaky breath, her mind reeling. What was he talking about? What did he know that she didn't? Everything had spiraled so quickly, and she wasn't sure who to trust anymore. The boy who had stood by her in the cafeteria had been kind, but was he involved in all of this? Or was he just another pawn in someone else's game? Before she could speak, the teacher's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with a grim expression, his eyes scanning the screen. Something changed in his demeanor, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice almost trembling as she stepped back, trying to make sense of the moment. The boy beside her noticed the teacher's sudden shift in posture and looked between them, confused. The teacher's lips tightened, and he pocketed the phone quickly, as if trying to hide the message from view. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but the fear wasn't just from the confrontation now, it was the overwhelming sense that something was unraveling, something that was beyond her understanding. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to do, but this ends now," the boy said, stepping forward. "You've made your move, but whatever game you're playing, it's over." The teacher's eyes flickered toward him. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like he was about to retaliate, to strike back. But instead, he just let out a soft sigh and glanced down at the phone once more. "You think it's over?" the teacher asked, his voice suddenly quieter, almost resigned. He looked at her one last time, his expression unreadable. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." Before she could react, the teacher turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of students. It was as if the tension had lifted just as quickly as it had arrived, leaving her breathless and bewildered. The boy looked at her, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What just happened?" he asked. Who was he talking to? Her mind was spinning, but one thought cut through the chaos: "I'm not the one you should be worried about." The teacher's words echoed in her ears, a strange warning she didn't fully understand. Who else was involved? Who else knew the truth? She glanced down at her phone again, trying to calm herself. The final message was still there: "It's time for you to make your move. Everything is about to change. Be ready." The same cold, ominous tone. "I have to go," she said suddenly, the weight of everything crashing down. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to find out who was behind all of this. She couldn't just sit back and let things play out. There were too many questions, too many mysteries left unsolved. The boy reached out to stop her, but she shook her head. "I need to figure this out. I need to know the truth." "Don't do this alone," he said, his voice full of concern. "You're not in this by yourself." But she couldn't let him get involved. This wasn't his fight. Whoever was behind the messages, behind the teacher's cryptic words, was playing a game she wasn't ready to lose. She couldn't drag anyone else down with her, especially when the stakes were so high. As she walked away, a cold breeze swept through the school grounds, as if signaling the beginning of something even bigger. Every step she took felt heavier, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her mind raced, her thoughts bouncing from one possibility to the next. Where could she go? Who could she trust? The answer, however, came far sooner than she expected. She turned a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. Standing at the end of the hallway was someone she didn't expect to see, not after everything that had just happened. Someone from her past. Someone who had vanished without a trace, someone who was supposed to be out of her life forever. It was him, the one person she thought had nothing to do with any of this. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. He hadn't changed, but his eyes. There was something in them, something that sent a wave of recognition crashing through her. He had always been a part of the past she was trying to forget, but now he was here, in the present. Like a ghost come to haunt her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaky but determined. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied quietly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach churn. You're deeper in this than you think. Her mind spun. The stakes had just been raised to a level she wasn't ready for, and as she stood there, face to face with him, she realized how far the web of secrets stretched. He wasn't just a bystander. He was part of it. He always had been. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, he stepped forward, pulling something from his jacket pocket. It was a flash drive, small, innocuous looking, but the truth behind it could shatter everything she had worked so hard to protect. I think it's time you learned the real story, he said, his voice low and almost sympathetic. The final twist hit her like a freight train. The person she thought had been her ally was the one who had orchestrated everything. Every message, every cryptic warning, had come from him. He had been playing her all along. Her heart dropped as he extended the flash drive to her. Now was the time for the truth. The flash drive felt heavier than it should have. It was a small thing, something that could easily be slipped into a pocket or bag, yet in that moment, it felt like it carried the weight of the world. She stared at the man who had appeared from her past, her heart pounding in her chest. He stood before her, calm, almost too calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Why? The word escaped her before she could stop it. Why all of this? Why play with my life like this? He didn't immediately respond, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. He seemed to struggle with the answer, as if what he was about to say was difficult, maybe even painful. But eventually he spoke, his voice softer than before. Because I needed you to understand the truth. You needed to see it for yourself, he said, his words measured. I didn't want to do this, but I had no choice. You were the key to everything. Her mind raced. What was he talking about? How could she be the key to anything? She had always been the one trying to keep her head down, to avoid attention, to escape the past. And yet, here she was, at the center of a game she didn't even know she was playing. You're not making any sense, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Just tell me what's on that flash drive. He gave her a sad smile. What's on there is the beginning. It's everything that's been hidden. Everything you never knew. The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had always known there was more to the story, but she had never guessed it would be like this. She hesitated, the fear crawling up her spine, but she knew she had no choice. She had to know. She had to understand why this was happening, why her life had been turned upside down so suddenly. Slowly, she took the flash drive from him, her fingers trembling. Without looking back at him, she walked over to a nearby computer, her heart hammering in her chest. She plugged the drive in, praying that whatever it contained, it would finally give her the answers she desperately needed. The screen flickered to life, and files began to open one by one. Each file seemed more cryptic than the last, but one in particular caught her attention. It was a video file. The name on it was simply her own name, and below that the words, "You don't know yet, but this is where it all begins." Her breath hitched in her throat. This was it. The moment that would change everything. She clicked on the file, her fingers shaking as the video began to play. The screen filled with the image of her younger self, smiling, carefree. She was in a place she hadn't thought about in years, her childhood home. The memories came flooding back, of days spent playing in the backyard with friends, of a life before everything had started to fall apart. But as the video continued, the image of her past began to distort. There was another face in the frame now, someone familiar, someone she had forgotten about. It was him. The man who had just handed her the flash drive was in the video, standing beside her in the background, watching her as if he were waiting for something. He was younger, but unmistakable. And then, the footage shifted again. The man was no longer standing quietly in the background, He was at the center of the frame, his hand on her shoulder, as if guiding her, shaping her future. The video cut abruptly to black. She sat there, frozen, her mind whirling with disbelief. That was impossible. She had no memory of this. None at all. How could he have been there, at that moment, shaping the trajectory of her life? And yet, here it was, proof that he had always been part of the plan, a part of the forces that had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Why didn't I remember any of this?" The man didn't respond at first, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally, he sighed, stepping closer to her. "Because you weren't meant to. It wasn't safe for you to know the truth." "Not yet," he said. "I had to protect you. For your own good. But now, everything is about to change. You're going to have to make a choice." "A choice? What choice?" Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't add up. "Why now? Why are you telling me all this now?" she asked, still trying to understand. "What's happening? Why was the teacher involved?" The man's eyes darkened. "The teacher was part of the bigger picture. There are forces at work that you don't even know about. People who have been watching you, manipulating the events in your life. I've been trying to keep you safe from them. But that's over now." Her heart began to race again. "Safe? From what? From who?" "There's more at stake here than you realize," he continued. "What's happening to you, what's been happening all along, it's just the surface. There's a larger plan at play. And you've been chosen to be part of it." She blinked, trying to wrap her head around his words. "Chosen for what?" He stepped back, his expression hardening. "There's no more time to explain. You need to make a decision. It's either all in, or you walk away. But if you walk away, there's no going back. You'll never be safe again. Not from them. Not from me." The weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had thought she was finally gaining control, finally understanding what had happened to her life. But now, it was clear that everything she knew, everything she thought was true, was just a piece of a much larger puzzle. The tension in the room was unbearable as she stared at him, her mind racing. She felt like she was teetering on the edge of something massive, something that would change her forever. The choice was hers, but she couldn't make it without knowing the full truth. How could she make a decision when she didn't even know what she was up against? She glanced at the flash drive, the weight of it still heavy in her hand. The answer was in there, buried within the files, within the video she had just watched. She had to dig deeper. She had to know the full story. And then it hit her. She knew what she had to do. Her fingers hovered over the mouse again, ready to search through the files one by one. But before she could click on anything, the door to the room suddenly burst open, and the boy from earlier appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with panic. "They're here," he said, his voice urgent. "We have to go. Now." She didn't hesitate. The choice had already been made. Whatever it was that was coming for her, whatever had been waiting in the shadows, it was time to face it head on. The past, the present, and the future had collided in a way she couldn't have predicted, and there was no turning back now. She grabbed the flash drive, slipped it into her pocket, and ran toward the door, the boy at her side. The world outside was waiting, and she didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear, she was no longer a victim. She was in control now. And she was ready to uncover the truth. As they ran into the unknown, the story wasn't over, not yet. The game was far from finished, and the next chapter was just beginning.